Kareem, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
You've had the pleasure of being at some very different types of organizations. And even at the organizations that you've been at, they've had quite a bit of evolution. And so one of the topics I wanted to explore with you are what were the different kind of flavors of organizations you stepped into? And let's maybe start with some of the differences and pull the thread from there.
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, the differences in the organizations, I went from a large organization. I've had several jobs before my current one, but even within my current job at Under Armour, I think one of the things that has been interesting is the evolution of the digital organization within the company. But I've also worked at startups and their approach to how to push like productivity, how to focus on quality, how to organize projects. All of that is very, very different. So it's been really interesting to me to go from one to the other and sort of like see the advantages, disadvantages of each.
Nice. So let's talk about what is it like when you go from an extremely engineering leading organization into one that's maybe hardcore, project management leading. What's that like?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that when you start thinking about organizations and the people in those organizations, not in terms of their positions, but in terms of the roles they fill, I think you start to see some patterns emerge. So one of the things that was interesting when I was at a startup, we had this notion of no project management. I mean, there were literally no project managers. And that's very different from the company I'm at now, which has a lot of project managers, and they're very focused on that sort of cross-team organization. But what happened at the startup was it's not that project management went away as a need, it just sort of fell to other people. And so cross-team communication, organization, messaging, sort of like retrospective type things, all of that fell to the engineering manager and product manager. And because it wasn't super well defined as to what that role encompassed, sometimes you had a variety of success, right? So if it
Mm,
happened to be an engineering manager or a product manager who understood the value of that, they spent time on it and focused on it. And those who didn't. And so you had poor communication. And so, the same can happen even when you do have a project manager if they're not great at what they do. But at least in that circumstance, it's a very well-defined role. And I think that's what having a position gives you is like you're forced to think of it, you're forced to think of that role, whereas it can disappear if you don't have it.
interesting. Yeah, I always love people are people regardless of their role, right? And you're gonna have, and then there's the culture, and maybe you have a culture where people are more inclined to call the ball while it's in the air and catch it and just you grab whatever
Yeah.
they're gonna grab regardless of the role. And sometimes even if they explicitly have that title, they might not really live up to it. I'm curious if you've seen any frameworks or common language around that. I mean, like I'm always a fan of races. I find that people find that that's a
Yeah.
little old school, but you know, whatever you call it, I feel like if you just throw down a laundry list of here's all the stuff that needs to get done, I don't care what the heck we call it. Someone's got to grab each one of these. Have you found any frameworks or anything that work for you?
I actually have found, yeah, I mean, so I'm not super knowledgeable about the other options like other than Racy, but Racy is what we have used at Under Armour pretty extensively. And when it is applied, it's actually really, really helpful. And the reason why, from an engineering perspective, from a digital perspective, this has been coming up a lot recently, actually, is if you're being asked to be accountable to something, then you have to have the ability to make your decisions. Like, um, so I guess what I'm saying is like, if someone says you are accountable to this software product, in other words, you have to make sure that it has fewer bugs, it works, it works well, it has high uptime, all that. If you're saying, if a leader comes to you and says you're accountable for this, then you have to have the power. You need to be empowered in order to make significant decisions about where that's going to go. So, for example, a very specific example is like if you're being asked to say like, okay, for this web application, um, we need to like keep the number of regressions down to, like some small percentage, some five. Let's say we're actually measuring that, and it's down to like 5% or whatever. Well, then you as a leader and who's accountable, if you know that you're accountable, then you can say, okay, well, if you want that, the two things have to happen. One, we have to slow down, we have to reduce the amount of new features that are going into this. and or we have to automate significantly the testing, right?
Mm.
So that's a decision where you're like, okay, if you're saying if you're saying I'm accountable and you're saying we have to increase our velocity, and we have to improve our quality, in order to keep all of those things in check, I need to be empowered to tell you this is what we're going to need in order to accomplish that. And as a leader, if you're, like red flags should start going up. If you start being asked for accountability, and then when you start to ask for things in order to support that, you have to say, I can't, I can't make that happen, so I can't be accountable, or you have to reduce, like whatever it is that you're asking me to do. Um, and that's what the RACI can help with. It can help make sure that like, all right, well, if you're informed, I mean, you obviously have the best intentions, and you want to make sure that this project and you're advising on this. Like, yes, you're an advisor, and ultimately you're not accountable to the success. I mean, you want it to be as successful as possible, but like, it's not that like that career type of like lock-in. You're just like, I'm going to help you. And that's really good to know when you're setting up any kind of project or any kind of long-term project, even if it's a product that you're going to support, in perpetuity.
It's amazing. You can never just get away from clear expectations, accountability, and empowerment. It's pretty basic stuff, but I feel we get kind of spun around titles, and not just the titles themselves, but maybe the baggage that different people have and the overloaded phrases and all that. I mean, I'm half tempted sometimes when we do kickoffs just to blank canvas everything. Just get rid of all of those like words and the labels and just write down the stuff that needs to get done on. I don't know. I was actually thinking this idea lately for a workshop for kickoffs. It's just literally write it down on balls and just start throwing them out into the room.
Yeah.
Like who's
Yeah.
gonna catch this one, right? Because someone will be like, "All right, you're the project manager. Okay, what does that mean? You manage the project. Okay, yeah, but what does that
Right.
actually mean in real life? I'm curious, what have you seen? Because none of these models are inherently good or bad, right? Like, because I've even seen, sometimes you see an organization that's hard, where the user experience team are the gods of the team. There's others where the
Right.
program and project managers are, and there's other times where the engineers are. How do you figure out for your team, on the stage at which your team is at, what the right model is for you?
Yeah, and I think what makes it even more complicated is that it's a moving target. So as the
Yes.
team, as attrition happens and as people come in and replace, like their focus no longer is the same, and you suddenly find yourself in a different situation. So I think the first thing I would say is like you need to have you need to set yourself up and your team set up so that you're constantly re-reviewing where you sit in the organization to better understand how to apply your thoughts on it. There's this. I was just actually listening to a podcast about Kaizen, which I'd never really heard about. But anyway, the idea is that you sort of meet periodically, and it's a way of applying good work to perpetual improvement. And I think that really applies here because um, when you are trying to figure out whether or not to, like where you fall in the organization, like right now, when I was at the startup, I was at Mapbox, and that startup it was an amazing engineering organization. Like they had, I don't know, 250 engineers. It was a 450 person company at the time, and just brilliant people. And it was very engineering driven. And there was really no question about where engineering sort of sat in the organization. The product we produced was software. When you're at a company like Under Armour, the product is no longer the software. The product is physical product that's being produced, but also a brand. So like an idea is part of the product. That's a completely different thing, and the place of technology in there is not set in stone. So it shifts over time. So how do you like see where you sit? And what I've come to realize is that like in an organization like Under Armour, we lead with technology for sure. Technology is an important part of everything that we do. Um, but at the same time, ultimately, you have to keep in mind that how you achieve that technological supremacy is going to change over time. Because if you need to push product more, if you need to push brand more, that's always going to take precedence over technology. Now you might use technology in order to achieve that, and that's like where opinions sort of like come and go. So some people might have the opinion that in order to improve our brand, we want to improve the applications that we use in order to buy the product. Like that's where they want to focus. And with those people come investments. So they're like, okay, let's invest here more into in the technology group. But I think what I realize at Under Armour is that it's going to fluctuate. And so when you think about like the decisions that you make as an engineering leader is like, okay, I want to make sure that I have some consistency in the output that we produce. So I'm not going to make any assumptions about the number of engineers I'm going to have. Like at
Mm.
Mapbox, I would say like engineer like you can't produce this product without a stable set of engineers that are at a certain level. Um, at Under Armour, like you need to think more about the product that you're producing and then making sure that you reach some foundation where it can be maintained with a flexible set of engineers who are applying their expertise on it. Sometimes you're going to have people who are not more junior, and sometimes you're going to have people who are more senior, and sometimes you're not going to have anyone at all. So can it stand the test of time in that sort of fluctuating marketplace? I think so. When I think about Under Armour, like I set myself up for making decisions based on that. And so when we think about, just going back to project management, um, that fluctuates as well. It fluctuates as well because it's, uh, well, for a lot of reasons, but for us, it fluctuates because the type of project manager you're going to be that's going to be working on your product might have a different background. So like they may not have a super technologically strong background. So how do you sort of work it into your whole process? And that's where we sort of fall back on, in my opinion, like CI/CD and automation, even though it's very important in any organization, it's really, really important in an organization that doesn't have, the predictability necessarily of like what 6 months from now your organization is going to look like. But you better be sure that the thing that your organization is built on top of in technology is able to hum, right? And it needs to be able to, like easy deployments, easy onboarding, easy like all of that stuff needs to happen relatively easily. We're not we're not breaking like in the technology space. We're not like innovating in terms of new computer science, models. We're not like thinking in terms of new paradigms of how to compute. Like we're using, um, well-established methodologies for getting software out and delivering it in a really fast way. And that's where our focus needs to be. So at Under Armour, that's different. Mapbox, the focus was like we need to develop the best possible algorithm for navigating from point A to point B. Like, how do we make sure we do that in a way that's better even than Google Maps? That is a completely different problem, right? And so that's what's always interesting to me is you can't apply the same sort of approaches. There's certain things that are always true, but understanding where you sit in the organization, where you sit in the marketplace is really, really, really important as an engineering leader.
That makes sense. Yeah, and to make sure you're not over investing in building software when that's not your core business. You talked a little bit about innovation there. I feel like some people just get hung up, and I've seen some engineers, and even myself when I was earlier in my career, I got hung up on this that I wanted to only be doing the crazy innovative, forward leaning, whatever software it could be. But then I found that I could get just as excited about because when you're doing something new at an organization or new within an industry, it might not be innovative, as a whole out there, but the fact that it is innovative for that industry and that client, that gets exciting to me just as much. And I found engineering teams, if you can connect them enough with the brand and the mission, I don't know if you've seen it as well, but they get just excited about it. Do you see that?
Absolutely. I went through the same sort of path that you did. Like I felt the same way. I felt like I needed to work at Google. Like now, like there's ChatGPT, like they're breaking ground on areas that were previously unbroken. And but there's lots of like little niches where there's a lot of interest. Like right now at Under Armour, we recently released a completely redone website that goes significantly faster, like 5 or 6 times faster. Um, and that was a challenge for us, right? Like we're not using new technology; it's all based on open source technology, but it's modern and it was really interesting to learn how to do that. And I think the team that's working on it was super duper engaged. They understand that we're
Mm.
using, but we're applying it in a way that is not all that, like not that commonplace. Like we are working on in this particular area, we are on the edge of where the technology is. Um, and I think that really helps people motivate people. And then even outside of the technology, like even like CI/CD, like I would love to be able to say, because it's such an important part of the whole process, but I'd love to be able to say at the end of the day that like, yeah, we can get out a release in under 10 minutes. That's a real like, yes, Facebook is releasing thousands of releases a day. They have an army of engineers, but it's a different problem set when you have like just a few engineers in a company that's not like that's not based entirely around technology. Um, to be able to do that is quite an accomplishment and a different
That's great. Because I feel like there's this misconception that engineering teams, they don't like to have a lot of change, right? Let's not change the way they're organized. Let's not, let's get them in their flow state and let them just kind of groove through the work that they have. But my experience, and I'm curious to hear yours, is they love change. You just need to have those right foundational things in place that you know that not everything's going to break and fall apart and turn to mayhem when it's changing. Has that been your experience? And I'd also love to hear, how do you get the team to rally around that type and like big change, right? The way that you're organizing your teams, the way that you're attacking things, maybe going vertically or horizontally. I'd love to hear your perspective there.
Yeah, I think that there's this cognitive load that happens, like this very unpleasant thing that happens over time, when, especially it's true for legacy software. If you didn't have a hand in building it, and you're not empowered to improve it, what you have is a situation where the engineer is not fulfilled, right? Like, because they're not able to explore their creativity, their skill set, their expertise, because they have to be nervous about every single thing that goes out, because there's a relatively good chance it's going to break something and they're going to be held accountable for it. And that's where the accountability comes back in. It's like, look, if you want me to work on this thing, you need to let me have some space in order to improve it so I don't feel terrified every time I release it. And so like that foundational, that technical debt, that's where, like understanding where the technical debt, like how far you go in terms of like what you fix with technical debt, it really comes down to like, I want to fix it enough so that I don't feel terrified every time I push a release. Like I think that should be the rule of thumb. And and if you don't have that, then you sort of like you need to revisit. You need to take 20-30% of whatever resources you have and just say like they're focused on making sure that we have a stable environment. And then the engineers, I mean, that unlocks, it's not just their happiness, because I'm very much about the happiness of the engineer, because I think that unlocks a bunch of other things. The engineers are happy, they're more creative, they're more productive, it creates an amazing culture. And how do you get happiness? I mean, obviously everyone's a little different, but ultimately it's about feeling, valued and impactful. If they can't get anything out, or it's such a struggle to get anything out, then they're not going to be happy, and they're not going to be impactful, not going to be productive. And so, like, what you need to fix that quickly. If that
Mm.
if that continues, you'll never get anywhere. You'll reach some plateau, and you'll just never. It'll go down every once in a while, but you'll never soar. So it's really really important.
Yeah, people just start checking out at that point. I am going to steal
Yeah.
that from you though, like the tech debt strategy, because everyone's trying to figure out how are we going to attack attack the technical debt. It's like, well, we're going to remove the horror and the fear from the organization as we attack this.
Right,
I love
right.
that.
It comes down to predictability. So like people want predictability. They want to be able to say the next thing I'm going to do is going to happen in 2 weeks. If you can't give that, then what engineers are being asked all the time, when are you going to get done? When are you going to get done? They're like terrified because they're like, well, I mean, if everything goes fine, 2 weeks, but in their head they're thinking like, I'm pretty sure nothing's going to go well here, and so I'm just going to bump it up another 2 weeks because who knows. Um, and so that's what you get is as from the business perspective, trust your engineers. Like if they're nervous about releasing it, it's because they have good reason to be. Um, and so they're either going to tell you, like if you're going to force me to give you a number here, I'm going to have to give you like a month or 2 months because I know that there's instability here. that's where it starts impacting the business, and that's where they need to start thinking about, hey, like listen to your engineers about this for a little bit.
Yeah, that's how you end up with like a 2 year backlog that doesn't really get chipped away at any given point. Pulling the thread on the developer and the engineer happiness. I know early in my, we've both been around a while. Early in my career, we are just building a lot of stuff bespoke because the platforms weren't really where they are today. And
Yeah.
now we're at a point that there's the platforms aren't only quote unquote mature, but there's a lot of pressure from executives, there's a lot of pressure from sales teams, and I think sometimes platforms are, I love them in the right place. I find that sometimes they're used incorrectly, and engineering teams can get disenfranchised in those environments. But I'm curious, from the various places that you've been, how do you navigate that, build versus buy, and how do you keep your engineering teams happy within that ecosystem of platforms that are all around you?
Well, I think the key is obviously you have to make the right decisions about the products you buy, but then once you buy them, you need to use them as they were intended to be used. There's a lot of some companies they will buy a product and then they'll be like, well, now you need to customize it. So they'll work with
Hmm.
these companies and they'll say, well, we need this one feature, and they're like, depending on the size of the company, if it's either a huge one, they'll say no, this is how you can figure it out yourself. Or if it's a small one, and this is worse, they'll make changes to the product because they're scrappy and they need revenue. That's the worst possible thing, even though it sounds good. Um, because now they've created a very customized thing for you that they're not going to be able to support. And you're going to get mad, they're going to get mad, and then nothing good will come of it. So I think the key is to make sure that when you make the decision about the product to buy, first of all, is that it has the features that you want as is. So like if they're saying things like, well, we're planning on that in 6 months, like absolutely not. Like no guarantee of that happening whatsoever. And so, like that needs to either make it off the list of requirements, or that company, that product makes it off the list entirely. But then the other thing is like once you do get it, I think there's this thing that I think people realize that like just because you got something off the shelf, I mean, SAP is a great example, right? Like it is an off-the-shelf product that requires an enormous amount of customization. Like it's really just a platform. Salesforce, Commerce Cloud, another example. Like if you are a brand and you need to customize your experience for the user because you are a brand and it's all about customization, think about that. Like yes, it's providing that value, but remember that you have to do a lot of work on top of it. So just work that into into your plans. And I think it's really just a matter of making sure that people understand that buying a product doesn't mean like set it and forget it. It almost never means that, especially for larger companies that like to customize. Now, if you go and like get a Shopify account, and you just set up it's great for that sort of thing. Like you can just set it up in no time. They have templates and you're in their zone. Like everything you're doing is just part of the platform. And that's fantastic. But you just have to keep that in mind. The one thing that I often say about build versus buy is like build the things that are, I think this is a very commonly held belief, but like, build the things that are unique to your organization that you need to differentiate yourself with. And the front end of the website, for example, or your applications, those are the areas where like a brand needs to show off. Like that's the clothes, right? It's the body of the car. Like the engine, like do your best, like find the product that can support the all the functionality that you need in order to, complete the journey for the user. But you're not gonna be breaking any new ground when it comes. You're not gonna be like an Amazon. It's just like actually, I'm just gonna completely redo the way we do cloud infrastructure. Like that's never going to happen, and therefore just use the functionality that's available to you. So that's number one. And then the other big one is like I have over the last 2 years, I have become a big proponent of the model where you have open source software that is supported by a company. So like they are operating in a way where they are using open source software that is available to you if you want and has a community around it, but they are providing a ton of support. They're providing potentially infrastructure. I used Vercel a lot because they're an amazing company that provides a lot of expertise around a few products like Next.js. And they provide all this infrastructure for you. You don't have to think about it at all. They provide a CI/CD sort of like yeah, deployment structure that you don't have to worry about at all. Like those sorts of things for a smaller company are invaluable and in my opinion worth the cost. So you just have to sort of do a little bit of math on that.
I think you last time we spoke, you even talked about a company where you asked for something to be added to the roadmap, and they told you absolutely not. Am I
Yes.
remembering that correctly?
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, so we've worked with companies like big authentication companies, Okta, and I guess they bought Auth0, but like they're doing what you should do, which is saying like, look, these are the feature sets that we have. We'll tell you what is on our roadmap, but like you got to use what you have. We're not going to build something custom for you, and that's okay. Like that's how it should be. Now you can make the decision in plain view and saying like, okay, but we really let's say it's like two-factor auth. Let's say they didn't have that or whatever. It's like, well, it is part of our plan to have two-factor auth at 6 months. It's not on your road, therefore I'm going to have to move to someone else. Like that's not like, okay, but can you please add it? And then say, okay, we'll promise. Like that's not a good plan, I don't think.
Yeah, I feel like one of the pitfalls that teams get into is you spend a lot of money on a platform and multiple platforms. And so then the strategy just kind of becomes, let's push as much into this thing until somebody says no, which they typically don't, or until something
Yeah.
breaks or becomes like a big mess, a giant mess, where it's like, if we just kind of put those guidelines and the foresight in place ahead of time and come up with a framework for ourselves, for our specific organization that says, here's what's going to go into the platform and why, and here's what's not going to and why it's not going to. Then at the same time, you're not only keeping things clean, but I think you can get the engineering teams excited because now they know, oh, we're not only dealing with the platform. Here's all this cool stuff we're going to build, and it's usually that stuff like you said that's much more meaningful to that organization, and it's the secret sauce, right?
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah, and you just have to establish that. You just have to make sure that's clear. Everyone comes in. One of the problems is that if as a company you keep changing your sort of methodology or don't define it very well, you hire in engineers with an idea of what they're going to be doing, and then it suddenly changes, and you have that breakdown in communication. Happiness goes away, productivity goes away. So, like establishing, really having a good understanding of your digital plan is really, really important.
I see a lot of passion in there for leading engineering teams. What is it about engineering teams that gets you excited?
For one thing, I sort of fall into this naturally because I'm, socially inept, like that's kind of my thing. But also, and like from an engineering perspective, like I definitely think the same way as a lot of engineers do. We have a lot of the same interests. We tend to have a lot of passion for the same things. And so I've been in engineering since I don't know, like 98. So, like 25 years or so of experience. And I went into management about 12 years into my stint. And one of the reasons I did that was because I really wanted to create a better environment for engineers. And so like it's like a personal passion of mine to create an environment where engineers can really thrive. What I've said almost all the time is that it is really rare when you don't have an engineer whose like potential is super duper high. Like what they're specifically doing and how they're getting there is a question of like that particular person. But I think the vast majority of people, if they actually have a passion for this stuff and you give them the runway, can do an amazing job in whatever like whatever path you set up for them. I think they can do an amazing job. In fact, my job as a leader is to step back, just like clear the path and have them go. And I think that model of doing it is I think is like obviously like the best thing that works for me. And I think it works for most, amazing engineers as well. They just don't always have that opportunity.
That's great. Yeah, and on the flip side, it's so frustrating when you see that passion just unnecessarily getting squashed just due to
Yes.
inefficiency at the org or not prioritizing or clarifying things. Man, I think you just broke my brain because I started around the same time, and 25 years, I didn't realize it was that long now. You're making me feel old right now.
I feel it every day. Yeah, I have a
Um,
young team, so
Nice. Well, Kareem, I really enjoyed this conversation. I always like to finish on one fun question, which is over the years, what's the best advice you've ever received in life, work, wherever?
actually I was at a company called Millennial Media and I had a manager. It was my first managing job. I was moving from like an IC type of role into more of a manager role. But I couldn't let go of the IC part of it. I still can't. But one of the things that always sort of pulls me back is what he said, which was like, you're going to be a lot more effective. Like, you have a team of five at the time, right? There is no way that you're going to do five people's work by yourself, right? So, like, the best thing that you can possibly do is empower the people on your team, and then you can do 5x. Like, at best, you can do two people's job. Like, you're never going to be someone who's going to do five people's job. And if you are, then there's something wrong with the team. I've always taken that back and just like, okay, yeah, like I'm very interested in this particular thing that we're doing. I think, like, yeah, all engineers are probably like this. They're like, I can do this best. And then I realized like that does not scale. Like, that is not a good approach. Pursue the things that you can, but keep in mind that lots of people, a team is makes all the difference. So I try to remember that as well as a leader.
That's great, especially because it appeals to that engineering mind of logic and efficiency that just makes
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense on that.
Yeah.
Kareem, thank you so much. I loved it.
Thank you.